So let's bring in now Independent Institute Senior Fellow Judy Shelton. And Judy, just, first let's start with the knee-jerk reactions on Friday to the announcement of Warsh.
I think it's another example of Trump Derangement Syndrome. It was a very bold choice, a solid choice, and he has lots of challenges before him, but I think Kevin Warsh is up to it.
Let's talk about that, because you lay out a scenario where reforms have to be made at the Federal Reserve. You focus on three areas. You call them the three M's. First, let's start with the models. Explain to us what that means, the Fed models, and how they should be reformed.
Well, President Trump makes a lot of sense when he talks about the perversity of good news being bad news. And that's because the Federal Reserve responds to reports of good growth and strong economic activity by threatening to raise interest rates. Because the Fed's models dictate that's the only way to fight inflation, to try to curtail demand. And it turns out that the better way to fight inflation is to increase supply. So what you really want is a model that accommodates a supply-side growth agenda, and instead of restricting capital, ends up providing access to capital to small and medium-sized businesses so they can hire people, produce more output, and increase supply. And that's the way you equilibrate demand and supply in an economy and have stable prices.
Judy, what about your thoughts on the Fed always coming down hard when Main Street gets a raise? It's like... if we see wages go up too soon, here comes the Fed with that mallet. They always say they've got this unending toolbox, but the only tool they really have is a mallet. And they come and they start to tamp down on the economy. Can Main Street, should Main Street be allowed to have a few raises?
Well, I think so, especially where the productivity is being concentrated in workers who can end up providing more output in goods and services by using AI. And so you want to keep that going, and for the Fed to punish workers who in most cases just want to keep up with the inflation is not only unfair, but it's so unequal, because meantime the people on Wall Street are making a bundle because they already own financial assets.
Yeah, I mean, it's so nuts to me, and I don't know why they can't see it. Let's talk about mechanisms for a moment. There's several mechanisms out there with respect to implementing Fed policy.
Well, the main one the Fed has been using since it was adopted in October 2008 at the height of the global financial meltdown is to pay banks to keep cash reserves sitting on deposit at the Fed. And the banks have gotten very used to that model. It works for them. They have a risk-free loan from the Fed, really, and they get paid a hefty interest rate. And what you really want to do is have mechanisms, and so I applaud Kevin Warsh for talking about this, that encourage banks to go back to being financial intermediaries and making capital available to the real economy, to the private sector.
Let's talk about management for a moment, and let's face it, you hear about politics creeping into the Federal Reserve. I have a board here, Democrat, Republican, not registered. You don't have a lot of orange in any of these slivers, whether it's certainly no board of governors, 7 Fed banks. It's so lopsided, and how do we make sure that politics really never drive monetary policy?
You need more muscular management. I think that Chair Powell must be aware that you have 10-to-1 registered Democrats to Republicans on his staff. And maybe it's inadvertent, but that is going to affect the objectivity of the way they present information. And I think it's reflecting a different philosophy of government and the role of a government agency in intervening in a free market economy.
Let me ask you before I let you go, the Fed, on accountability. For a long time, we talked about accountability on one hand. In the last several months, we've been hearing about Fed independence. Even some Republican senators and lawmakers are, adamant about Fed independence. But, I talked about this on Friday. The way the Federal Reserve is designed, the system is overseen by Congress. However, each of the Fed has 3 parts: the Board of Governors, Regional Reserve Banks, FOMC, and they operate independently of the federal government. So, I mean, it just feels like ultimately there is no accountability. And my question is, the Fed, can they hide behind the veil of independence and never be accountable forever?
Well, that's what they've been relying on. And even when the Federal Reserve should reasonably be able to account for overspending on their own refurbishments, for Chair Powell to refuse to respond to an inquiry from the Department of Justice and then claim central bank independence as providing the Fed being above the law and not having to be accountable, I think that was really a violation of democratic norms. The head of this powerful political and prominent government agency, it should not be impossible for him to have to even be fired or face punishment for bad management. He should be questioned, and I think it's inappropriate for him to suggest that he doesn't have to be accountable in that respect.
I agree 1,000%. And this notion that somehow Fed independence means that they're excluded from accountability from the American public is crazy. It's atrocious. Judy, you made a good run for it, young lady. I'm sure we'll be seeing, your gold call's been one heck of a call. We'll see you again soon.